crew traveled to Penn State University for an interview with Dr. Michael Mann, director of the Earth System Science Center. Dr. Mann was one of the lead authors of the third IPCC report, which was credited along with Al Gore for the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He's authored over 160 peer-reviewed, edited publications and is the author of 2 books, most notably The Hockey Stick and Climate Wars, Dispatches from the Front Line. This is his book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars. When did you first write this book?
In 2012. So it was some years after sort of many of the episodes that I describe in dealing with climate change denialism, something that I've endured for more than a decade ago because of this graph that we published back in the late 1990s, the hockey stick graph.
You know, you were the sort of had nothing to do with you personally. It was just that you went public with something that they really did not want to see go public?
Yes, and there's a history here. When you look at the fossil fuel industry and their attacks on climate science, they're really using the same playbook that was used by the tobacco industry decades ago, the pharmaceutical industry. Every time that the findings of science and the findings of scientists have found themselves on a collision course with vested interests like the fossil fuel industry or the tobacco industry, those industries have sought to wage a disinformation campaign to try to discredit the underlying science.
Right.
And often by going after the scientists themselves. And that's the position that I found myself in because of this iconic graph, the hockey stick, that really demonstrated in a very easy to understand way just how profound an impact we are having on our planet right now with the burning of fossil fuels and the warming of the planet that's resulting from that.
When was it, 1988, the first IPCC report came out, and the PR guy, you've seen that memo, right? Here's what we need to do. And success in discrediting these people will involve when the media it says that there's confusion or that some scientists don't agree. I mean, they had markers for the success of their PR program. And that memo was out. You know, in the early 90s. How did it take so long for, say, the LA Times, who did the expose on Exxon and how long they knew? What happened? Where has the media been in calling these guys out?
Yeah, I mean, there's really been a drumbeat since the early 1990s when the scientific consensus emerged, when the world scientists had concluded that climate change is real. It's caused by human activity, in particular the burning of fossil fuels. Once there was a consensus within the scientific community, the fossil fuel industry decided that they had to attack that consensus, and they had to do so by attacking climate scientists. Probably the critical year was 1995, when the second report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change,
yes,
the IPCC,
right, with jargon, yes.
Yeah, when that report came out, and it stated that it was the consensus of the world scientists that there was now a discernible human influence on the climate. Those were fighting words to the fossil fuel industry.
Right.
And what they did is to double down in their campaign of denial and deceit, continuing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in a massive disinformation campaign.
And they bought a few scientists, right? Like Fred Singer, Pat Michaels. I mean, these guys...
Some of those names, some of the same scientist advocates who were being paid by the fossil fuel industry to deny human-caused climate change were actually getting paid by the tobacco industry in earlier decades. Not only the same playbook, it was the same players.
Right.
The same players.
That's interesting.
I call them deniers for hire.
But see, what was, I guess, brilliant in a way was that those guys allowed the think tanks and the talk radio hosts to amplify their message to contradict all it, and it's been every goofy theory you can think of. It's like when one of their wacky theories gets finally resolved or, you know, proven beyond a doubt and behind, you know, a statistical doubt, a p-value, they find a new one.
Well, it's like the mythical Hydra, right? You cut off one head and two more heads grow back in its place. Or if you like, since zombies are popular today in our culture, we can think of these as zombie myths. It doesn't matter how many times they've been refuted. It doesn't matter how many times they've been discredited. The same myths come up over and over again because there's really a cynicism on the part of those who are sort of promoting climate change denialism, that as long as they can just state something authoritatively enough, if they just repeat it over and over again, then it somehow becomes truth. We live in a world now where people feel entitled to their own facts when it comes to issues like climate change. And that's problematic because, the science is very clear. There is a reasonable debate to be had about the solutions to the problem, but there's no longer any reasonable factual debate to be had about whether the problem exists.
Right. We actually knew the basic physics of the greenhouse gas effect 150 years ago, right? Something like that?
Nearly 200 years ago.
Nearly 200 years ago.
Joseph Fourier, a famous early 19th century scientist, the same scientist who gave us the law of heat conduction.
Okay.
How heat travels through objects.
I think we all agree on that.
Right? He understood nearly 200 years ago that there was this thing called the greenhouse effect and that it warms the planet. And essentially we have been refining our understanding of climate change over this nearly 2-century long period. But we knew the basics almost 2 centuries ago. It was actually the Republican Party that put forward the notion that we could solve global environmental problems through market mechanisms. That's what cap and trade, that's what a carbon tax is about. It's about using the market to solve this problem, but dealing with what we call an externality, an impact that isn't priced into the market unless we give the market a price signal through a carbon tax or through tradable emissions permits. And those were Republican ideas. Yeah. And now, unfortunately, when our president, our current president, Barack Obama, proposed to use those market mechanisms to deal with climate change, now the very same Republican Party that used to embrace this
like
approach
John McCain,
is running away
because he was
from
on board
it.
with cap and trade.
Absolutely.
When we were working on the Chicago Climate Exchange. And then when he ran for president, it was a hoax.
McCain was a climate hawk.
Yeah.
He was actually one of the senators who was most proactive in trying to bring legislation to deal with climate change. And unfortunately, he moved away from that position when it became politically expedient for him to do so.
It's a big, complex subject. It really is. I mean, you guys, you are rocket scientists.
But it is actually NASA is one of the leading climate science laboratories in the country. So literally, the same NASA that gave us space travel is today applying their talents to working on the issue of climate change.
This is who's lying to you. NASA, the Pentagon, the military, the National Academy of Sciences, the American Meteorological Association, the American Geophysical Association, the American Medical Association, the AMA. All of these people are lying to you.
and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, by the way, which has weighed in affirmatively that climate change is real and human-caused and already a problem. Or how can you argue disingenuously that acting on climate change will destroy the economy, which is what the critics love to say, when in fact the cost of inaction is far greater already than the cost of taking action. And they will cite economic studies.
Oh, the Heartland studies.
Absolutely.
And all
Pseudo-economic.
All right, Michael, let's do a little 101, 201, 301 for people who don't, they come from different levels. 101, I think the biggest confusion was the difference between the word global warming and climate change. I say cause and effect. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, they're just terms that describe different aspects of the same phenomenon. So global warming is the overall warming of the globe because of the burning of fossil fuels and the increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. Now, the warming is
like a blanket,
keeps that heat down towards the surface of the Earth and warms up the surface. But that warming does a whole bunch of other things, too. It changes weather patterns. It causes ice to melt, which gives us sea level rise. It shifts rainfall and drought patterns around. There are all of these other ways that the warming of the Earth changes our climate. And so climate change is the more all-encompassing term that describes all of the things that happen because of our warming of the planet.
Right. Now, scientists, we love you to death, but you often speak in Celsius and stuff, and Americans, we never could get that whole thing, right? But so the planet's warmed 1.5 degrees thus far, right? And people say that's nothing, but they don't understand the difference between that and global average temperatures and how big that is. And when they talk about 2C, the goal of the Paris Agreement or below that, it sounds minuscule, but why on a global average basis is it so huge?
Right, because as you allude to, small changes in the average temperature of the Earth can imply very large changes in regional climates. Take the last ice age, 20,000 years ago, when there was ice covering a large part of the northern hemisphere. Now, the average global temperature was probably only about 4 degrees Celsius to 5 degrees Celsius, so in the range of 7 to 9 degree Fahrenheit colder than today.
And if we do nothing happens scenario, we don't do anything, we're way overshooting that, right?
By the end of this century, we will see more than 4 to 5 degrees Celsius warming of the globe if we continue with business as usual burning of fossil fuels. So over 1 century, we will create a change in climate that is as large as the difference between an ice age and a normal climate like we had before industrialization.
Right. The other question is, how do you know that it's man-made? People ask that question. You use statistics, right?
It's even simpler than that. We can look at the various factors that drive climate. There are natural factors like volcanic eruptions, which can cool the planet. There are changes in how bright the sun is, and we can document those changes. The natural factors that are at work, we can put those into the climate models. And when we do that, what the models say is that the Earth should have actually cooled over the last half century if it was natural factors that were primarily at work. We can only explain the fact that it's warmed from the human effect of increasing greenhouse gases.
And plus you can look out the window and watch TV and see it happening and see these extremes. Texas, Houston, this flooding, that's insane. They've never had
unprecedented wildfire out in Alberta, an ongoing unprecedented drought in California.
A 1,200-year drought.
At least. We can
yeah.
only go back 1,200 years. It could be even longer, how unprecedented this drought is. What's happening now is that it's becoming more and more difficult for the forces of denial and delay to convince people of their case, because people are seeing this with their own eyes. You can't tell somebody climate change isn't happening when they're seeing the impacts themselves in their daily lives.
Okay, 201. The problem there is we have to act now before everybody can't deny it any longer because they see it, because there's a time gap. These stay in the atmosphere much longer, right? So everyone talks about over the next century. Are we going to be seeing more abrupt changes in the coming years, 5, 10 years? I mean, are people really going to start to see more ecosystems failing, ice melting, things like that?
Well, it's like the Titanic. When it saw the iceberg, it was too late, because when you see the iceberg, you see that little bit of ice. There's a whole lot more ice underneath, and climate change is sort of the same way. We've got this ship.
Do we see the iceberg yet?
We do. We see the iceberg. We've got this huge ship, and it's difficult to move that ship quickly. The analogy holds with the climate. The climate will continue to warm several decades into the future. Sea level will continue to rise for centuries simply in response to the fossil fuels that we've already burned, the warming that we've already created. There's a certain amount of additional climate change that's in the pipeline. It's baked in. Now, what we can still do, what the models tell us is still possible, if you do the math, it's still possible to prevent a level of warming of the climate, more than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, that scientists who study the impacts of climate change will tell you constitutes truly dangerous and potentially irreversible.
And that's the good.
The good news is we can still avoid that.
We can still get to very dangerous and maybe we won't survive, but we can get there.
We can, what the presidential science advisor, John Holdren, said about a year ago, he said, look, the response to climate change is going to be a combination of three things. Adaptation, adapting to the changes that are happening and are in the pipeline. Mitigation, stopping our burning of fossil fuels so we can prevent catastrophic warming of the planet. And the third alternative is suffering. And the fact is, we are already committed to some combination of all three of those things. There will be some suffering that will take place, that's already taking place, simply because of the climate change that's already happening. We're now coming to the end of what was an historic El Nino event, by some measures the largest El Nino event on record. Now, can we say with certainty that part of why it was such a large El Nino event wasn't itself because of human-caused climate change? We can't. That remains a possibility.
I hate when you guys say that stuff.
Well,
when you say you can't tie one extreme event to it, here's my answer to that. Because you're scientifically right, and that's your methodology, right? But that's like saying to someone who has diabetes, I don't know exactly which donut gave me the diabetes, but the fact that I eat donuts and sugar and all this stuff, and that's my...
Oh, that's right. No, and we can talk about it. No, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that some scientists, some of my fellow scientists will look at this and say, well, this was just a natural event. It was just an El Nino. Well, the fact is, it was a huge El Nino, a whopper of an El Nino, and we can't rule out the possibility that that was caused by climate change, although many scientists will. They'll say, oh, well, this was just a natural effect. It happens
every 7 years or something. Yeah.
And, moreover, typically an El Nino year is a wet year in California. It's a year with a heavy snowpack. A big El Nino event should have taken us out of this ongoing decade-long drought, and it didn't.
So some people think El Ninos are the solution.
Yeah.
That's crazy talk, right?
It is. First of all, El Ninos may be getting larger because of climate change. They may be becoming more frequent. And while there are certain things like, with California drought, El Ninos in the past have sometimes been a reprieve from drought, although this year it wasn't. El Ninos also cause all sorts of bad things elsewhere. And then there's the flip side. If you have a big El Nino event like we just had, there's a good chance it'll be followed by a big La Nina event, the opposite. And that's what's happening. We are going into a La Nina event. La Nina years tend to be associated with larger numbers of hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean. And this is part of why my group here at Penn State has forecast an unusually active season. Two things going on.
Wait, there's got to be a drum roll. How many hurricanes do we...
We're forecasting 19 tropical storms, which is not a record, but it's close to a record level. The record was 2005. There were 28 storms. And why was that? There were two things going on. Sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic were as warm as they've ever been. Climate change is playing a role in that. And we had a very large La Nina event. And La Nina events add to the level of hurricane activity. So it's sort of, forgive the pun, a perfect storm. You've got anomalous warmth in the tropical Atlantic, which is becoming more and more common because of global warming. During a La Nina year, there's a change in the trade winds, the wind patterns in the Caribbean Ocean and the tropical Atlantic, and that change in wind patterns creates a more favorable environment for the very organized pattern that's required for the development and strengthening of a hurricane. Yeah.
Now, Katrina was 2005.
Katrina was part of that record 2005 season. So it wasn't just that we had a record number of storms. We had some of the strongest and most damaging, devastating storms we've ever seen. Sometimes you can have a relatively inactive season like 2012. Now, you could point to that and say, oh, it wasn't that active a season.
And they did, yeah.
But we got Superstorm Sandy, which was one of the most destructive tropical storms, hurricanes that we've ever seen.
And then the Philippines?
That's right. Hurricane Haiyan, Super Typhoon Haiyan, strongest storm ever seen in that part of the world. Earlier this year, Hurricane Patricia in the Pacific, strongest hurricane we've ever seen, 216-mile-per-hour winds. The contrarians would like to convince you that we are alarmists as a scientific community, that we're overstating the threat. But if you look at the science and the way it's played out and how what's happening compares with our earlier predictions, things are happening even faster than we predicted. Arctic sea ice is disappearing faster. The ice sheets are losing ice faster, which is contributing to sea level rise earlier than we expected. The stakes have never been higher. I mean, the fate of the planet literally does hang in the balance of this next presidential election, and you couldn't have two candidates where there was a starker contrast between one, as you say, Donald Trump, who's just an outright climate change denier.
But it's not funny anymore.
No, it's not. And again, the contrast couldn't be greater between these two candidates. And so we have a decision before us this fall. Do we want to continue in the direction that we've been moving towards joining the rest of the world in solving what may be the greatest challenge that human civilization has ever faced? Or do we want to just give up and give in and retrench?
Climate change is not a linear process. It's accelerating, and who knows. But also the solutions are not linear.
That's right.
Right? So tell us, give us that hope, because people think even if we get the right people in the office and the right policies, we still can't do it. But technology, it's accelerating at such an incredible speed, right?
That's right. No, I mean, there are reasons for cautious optimism here. One of them is that there is still time to prevent catastrophic warming of the planet. If we reduce our emissions now, we can prevent more than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 Fahrenheit warming of the planet, which is what many scientists would say is where we truly get into the range of catastrophic climate change. And the numbers are heading in the right direction. Last year, we actually saw carbon emissions drop globally for the first time in many decades, even as the global economy grew. And again, we couldn't have a starker choice before us this fall.
Right.
Either we move forward and we solve this problem, or we ensure that we leave behind a degraded planet for our children and grandchildren.
I'm so glad that scientists like yourself, Michael, have decided not to just put your scientific papers in, but also be an advocate for what it is. If a doctor diagnosed you with cancer and said, oh, well, I don't get involved in that, I'm just diagnosing you, you're kind of in that same position, right?
Well, I want to thank you, Nancy, for helping us get that word out.
Yeah, we will get that word out. And I do believe, I have hope. I do believe that things will come together. I think when the human spirit, Henry David Thoreau once said, we have to examine how we live our lives. And I think there are more people that are thoughtful than those that aren't. I do.
I like to think that too.
Good. Michael Mann, Dr. Michael Mann, our guest here today.
We can't undo climate change. There's no way to undo it. It's the only decision that we are making right now that is irreversible. I want to say that again. This is the only decision, policy-wise, that we